This partnership agreement is absolutely rejected, Julian said, his voice flat and loud enough to bounce off the glass walls of the conference room. He didn't just say it. He held the document up, the 30-page agreement I had spent 6 months negotiating, the one that was supposed to save our division, and he ripped it down the center. The sound was sharp, like a bone snapping, in a quiet room. He didn't look at me. He looked at the board of directors, lined up along the mahogany table. He dropped the torn halves onto the polished wood in front of me, the pages fanning out in a messy, defeated pile. "We don't need dead weight," he told them, pointing a manicured finger at the paper. "And we certainly don't need contracts that tie us to old-world methods. I'm rejecting this. And frankly, we should be rejecting the person who wrote it." The room went dead silent. No one moved. I didn't move. I just looked at the jagged tear running through the bold text of the title page. But before I tell you what happened in that room, and how long I waited for that exact moment of humiliation, I'd love to know where you're listening from today. Drop your city or state in the comments. It's always amazing to see how far these stories travel. My name is Jonah. I am 42 years old, and I have a habit of lining up my pens on my desk until they are perfectly parallel, with exactly 1 inch of space between them. It calms me. It gives me a sense that the world has order, even when the people running it are doing their best to create chaos. I've worked at Sterling & Oates for 15 years. We deal in architectural salvage, high-end reclaimed materials. If a historic bank in Chicago gets demolished, we are the ones who go in to save the marble columns, the brass fixtures, and the 100-year-old oak paneling. It is dirty, heavy, honest work. It smells like dust and linseed oil. I love the smell of linseed oil. It smells like preservation. It smells like second chances. For 12 of those years, I ran the procurement division. I was the guy in the hard hat, standing in the rain, negotiating with demolition crews, making sure we got the heart pine beams before they were tossed into a chipper. I knew the texture of good wood. I knew the weight of real brass versus plated junk, and I knew how to talk to people. In this business, a handshake still meant something. At least, it used to. Then the founder, a good man named Arthur, had a stroke. He survived, but he had to step back. The board brought in his son-in-law to take over the day-to-day operations, while Arthur remained as the silent chairman. The son-in-law's name was Julian. Julian was 35, going on a self-important 50. He didn't own a hard hat. I don't think he owned a pair of jeans. He wore suits that shimmered under the fluorescent lights, tight around the shoulders, and he always chewed on ice. That was the sound of the office now. The crunch, crunch, crunch of Julian chewing ice from his oversized tumbler while he stared at spreadsheets he didn't understand. From the first day Julian walked onto the procurement floor, he looked at us like we were the debris. He didn't see the value in the relationships I had built. He saw numbers. He saw inefficiencies. "Why are we paying this hauler 3% more than the market rate?" he asked me in our first meeting. He didn't offer me a seat. He just stood by the window, looking out at the parking lot, crunching his ice. "Because he shows up at 4 a.m. on Sundays if we need him," I said, keeping my voice level. "And because he knows how to transport stained glass without cracking it. The market rate haulers break 20% of the inventory." Julian waved a hand, dismissing the words as if they were buzzing flies. "Get a cheaper hauler. We have insurance for breakage. It's a numbers game, Jonah. You need to stop thinking like a carpenter and start thinking like an executive." That was the beginning. Over the next 2 years, Julian systematically dismantled everything that made the company work. He fired the veteran warehouse manager, a man who could tell you the provenance of a limestone block just by touching it, and replaced him with inventory software that constantly glitched. He stopped paying our vendors on time, extending terms from 30 days to 90 days, which caused our best demolition partners to stop calling us. The quality of our stock dropped. We started getting complaints. Architects who had trusted us for a decade started returning shipments because the wood was warped or the stone was chipped. I tried to fight it. I wrote memos. I showed him the data. I lined up my pens on my desk, took a deep breath, and walked into his office to explain that we were losing our reputation. "You're too emotional, Jonah," Julian would say, not looking up from his phone. "You're attached to the past. The industry is pivoting. We need volume. We need speed. Nobody cares about the soul of the wood." He began to freeze me out. He stopped inviting me to strategy meetings. He moved my office from the corner with the view of the lumber yard to a small, windowless room near the break area. It was a petty, calculated move designed to make me quit. He wanted me to leave so he could bring in his own head of procurement, probably some kid from business school who would work for half my salary and ask zero questions. But I didn't quit. I couldn't. I had a daughter in college and a mortgage. Yes, but it was more than that. I loved this place. I had built this division. I wasn't going to let a man who chewed ice and wore shiny suits burn it to the ground without a fight. The turning point, or what I thought was the turning point, came 6 months ago. We got wind of the Holloway project. The Holloway Trust was restoring an entire block of Victorian row houses in the historic district. It was a massive job. They needed period-accurate flooring, doors, mantels, and hardware. It was a multi-million-dollar contract, the kind that could secure our revenue for the next 3 years. It was also the kind of job that required trust. The Holloway Trust didn't hire vendors. They hired partners. Julian wanted it bad. He needed a win. The board was starting to ask questions about the dipping profits and the high turnover rate. Julian needed a big, flashy number to put on the quarterly report. He tried to pitch them himself. He went to lunch with the Holloway director, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Sarah. From what I heard, the lunch lasted 45 minutes and ended with Sarah checking her watch and politely declining dessert. Julian came back to the office, red-faced and slamming doors. He had tried to dazzle her with projections and scale, but Sarah wanted to talk about grain patterns and curing times. Julian didn't know the difference between white oak and red oak. A week later, Julian called me into his office. He looked tired. There were dark circles under his eyes, but the arrogance was still there, hard as granite. "I need you to handle the grunt work on the Holloway deal," he said, tossing a file folder onto the edge of his desk. He didn't hand it to me. He made me walk over and pick it up. "They're stuck in the past. They want technical specs. Go meet with them. Get the specs approved. But I handle the final pricing and the signing. You're just the mechanic." "I can do that," I said. "And Jonah?" He leaned forward. The leather of his chair creaked. "Don't think this makes you indispensable. You're fixing a problem. That's all. If you don't land this, we're gonna have to make some structural changes to the staff. And I think you know who's at the top of that list." I took the file. I went back to my windowless office. I aligned my pens. And then I went to work. For the next 5 months, I lived and breathed the Holloway project. I met with Sarah 2 or 3 times a week. We didn't meet in boardrooms. We met at the salvage yard. I walked her through the aisles of reclaimed lumber. I showed her the stacks of heart pine we had been seasoning for 5 years. I let her smell the linseed oil and the cedar. I showed her how we cleaned the brass hardware by hand, not with harsh chemicals that stripped the patina. Sarah was tough. She asked hard questions about our supply chain, about our ethical sourcing, about our delivery guarantees. I answered every single one with the truth. When we didn't have an answer, I told her I would find it. I didn't try to sell her. I just showed her that I understood the mission. "You're not like your boss," she said to me one afternoon. We were standing in the dust of the warehouse, looking at a stack of antique doors. "Julian has his own way of doing things," I said carefully. "He's a shark," she said, running her hand over the rough wood of a door frame. "Sharks are good for eating, Jonah. They aren't good for building." We built a rapport. Slowly, the Holloway Trust began to trust me. They weren't buying from Sterling and Oates anymore. They were buying from Jonah. I drafted the contract myself. It was complex. It involved sourcing guarantees, quality control benchmarks, and a specific timeline that required absolute precision. It was a 3-year exclusivity agreement. It meant they would buy everything from us, provided we met the standards I had outlined. It was the perfect deal. It protected the company. It guaranteed work for the warehouse team. It was fair. I finished the final draft on a Tuesday. I printed it out, a thick, substantial document. I bound it with a simple clip. I felt a sense of pride I hadn't felt in years. I had done it. I had saved the division. And maybe, just maybe, I had proven to the board that Julian's way wasn't the only way. I put the contract on Julian's desk on Wednesday morning. "Is this it?" he asked, not looking up from his laptop. "That's the final agreement," I said. "Sarah is ready to sign. The board just needs to approve our end, and you need to countersign." "Fine," he said. "I'll read it." He didn't read it. I knew he didn't. I watched his calendar. He was out playing golf Wednesday afternoon. Thursday, he was in meetings with his efficiency consultants. Friday morning was the board meeting where the vote would happen. That Friday morning, the air in the office felt heavy. It was raining, a cold, gray drizzle that streaked the windows. I arrived at 7 a.m. I checked the inventory one last time. I walked through the warehouse, nodding to the guys. They looked worried. Everyone knew that if the Holloway deal fell through, layoffs were coming. "Is it gonna happen, Jonah?" one of the forklift drivers asked me. "I did my part," I told him. "The rest is up to them." The board meeting was scheduled for 10 a.m. At 9:50, Julian's assistant, a nervous young woman named Chloe, came to my office. "He wants you in the room," she whispered. She looked pale. "In the boardroom?" I asked. Usually, I wasn't invited. "Yes," he said. "He said he wants you there to explain the technical limitations to the board." That phrase worried me. Technical limitations? There weren't any. I had solved them all. I grabbed my notebook. I made sure my pen was in my pocket. I walked down the long hallway to the executive wing. The carpet changed from gray industrial loops to plush navy blue. The air smelled different here, like cleaning products and stale coffee. No sawdust. I walked into the boardroom. The table was huge, an oval of dark cherry wood. Arthur, the chairman, was there. He sat at the head of the table. He looked frail, slumped slightly in his wheelchair, a blanket over his legs. He had suffered a second minor stroke a few months back and rarely spoke now. His eyes were open, but they looked watery and distant. It broke my heart to see him like that. He had built this company with his bare hands, and now he was just a figurehead, watching his son-in-law dismantle it. The other 6 board members were there, looking at their tablets, and Julian stood at the front of the room, near a projection screen. "Ah, Jonah," Julian said. He smiled. It wasn't a nice smile. It was the smile a predator gives before it bites. "Come in. Stand over there." He pointed to a spot against the wall, away from the table. Like I was a servant, I walked over and stood with my hands clasped behind my back. I felt the stone in my pocket, a small, polished piece of river rock I kept for stress. I rubbed my thumb over the smooth surface. "I've been reviewing the proposal Jonah put together for the Holloway Trust," Julian announced to the room. He picked up the document from the table. It was my draft. "And?" asked one of the board members. "A man named Sterling, no relation to the founder, just a coincidence. It's a major contract, Julian. We need this revenue." "We need revenue," Julian agreed. "But we don't need shackles." He turned to look at me, his eyes dead cold. "Jonah here has spent 6 months negotiating a deal that gives away the farm. I read the fine print last night. He was lying. He hadn't read it. Or if he had, he didn't understand it. He has agreed to quality standards that are impossible to meet without doubling our labor costs," Julian said, his voice rising. "He has agreed to penalties for late delivery that would bankrupt us. He has prioritized craftsmanship over profitability." I stepped forward. "Sir, that's not accurate. The pricing structure accounts for the extra labor. The margin is actually 3% higher than our standard because Holloway is paying a premium for the guarantee. It's all in Section 4. Julian's face tightened. He hated being corrected. "I know what's in Section 4, Jonah. I'm the one who has to sign the checks. You're just the one playing with wood blocks." He turned back to the board. "This contract creates a partnership where we are the servants. It locks up our inventory for 3 years for one client. It prevents us from pivoting to the new, lower-cost import materials I've been sourcing from overseas. It is a strategic dead end." He paused for effect. He looked at Arthur, the chairman, who was staring blankly at the table. Then, he looked at the rest of the board. "This leadership team is about the future," Julian said. "And this," he held up the document. "This is the past. That was when he did it. This partnership agreement is absolutely rejected," he said. He grabbed the thick stack of paper with both hands. It was heavy stock, hard to tear, but he put his back into it. He ripped it. Rip. The sound was violent. He tore through the signature line, through the terms, through the 6 months of my life I had poured into those pages. He threw the pieces on the table. They slid across the polished surface, one half stopping just inches from Arthur's hand. "I will not sign this," Julian declared. "I am going to call the Holloway Trust this afternoon and tell them that if they want to do business with Sterling and Oates, they do it on my terms, or they can go find some salvage yard in the dump." He turned to me. "And Jonah, Since you seem to be unable to understand the direction of this company, I think it's time we part ways. Pack your desk. You're done. The silence that followed was absolute. My heart hammered against my ribs. I felt the heat rising in my neck. I looked at the torn paper. I looked at Julian's smug, triumphant face. He had planned this. He wanted a public execution. He wanted to show the board that he was the alpha, that he could make the tough calls to cut the dead weight. I took a breath. I rubbed the stone in my pocket one last time. I didn't yell. I didn't beg. I didn't cry. You're making a mistake, Julian, I said quietly. The only mistake was keeping you on this long, he sneered. Security will escort you out. I nodded slowly. I turned to leave. I reached for the door handle. Wait, the voice was raspy, weak, but it cut through the room like a saw blade. It wasn't Julian. Everyone turned. Arthur, the chairman, was pushing himself up. His hands, shaking with tremors, were gripping the edge of the mahogany table. He wasn't looking at the table anymore. He was looking at Julian. And his eyes weren't watery or distant. They were sharp. They were burning. Arthur, Julian said, his voice faltering slightly. Arthur, sit down. You don't need to worry about this. I handled it. You handled nothing, Arthur wheezed. He stood all the way up. It was a struggle, but he did it. He pointed a trembling finger at the torn contract on the table. That was the Holloway contract? It was a bad deal, Arthur, Julian said quickly, putting on his soothing voice. Jonah negotiated a bad deal. I'm protecting the company. Arthur ignored him. He looked at me. Jonah, he said. Did Sarah Holloway agree to those terms? Yes, sir, I said, stopping at the door. She was ready to sign today. Arthur looked back at Julian. You just tore up the Holloway contract. I did, Julian said, trying to regain his posture. To show strength. You idiot, Arthur said. The word hung in the air. Excuse me? Julian stiffened. You didn't just tear up a contract, Arthur said, his voice gaining a surprising amount of strength. You tore up the only thing keeping the bank from foreclosing on this building. Julian laughed nervously. What are you talking about? The financials are cooked, Arthur spat. I've been watching. I may be sick, but I'm not blind. You've leveraged us to the hilt to pay for your consultants and your new office. The bank gave us until the end of the month to show a guaranteed revenue stream of at least $2 million, or they call the loans. That contract. He pointed to the shredded paper. That was the guarantee. The room went cold. The other board members started shuffling papers, looking at each other with wide eyes. Julian's face went pale. I didn't know that. Why didn't anyone tell me? Because you don't listen, Arthur shouted, slamming his hand on the table. You don't ask. You just talk. Arthur took a jagged breath. He looked at me again. Jonah, can we fix this? Can you call Sarah? Can you get her to print another copy? I looked at Arthur. I felt an immense sadness for him. He was a good man, but he had waited too long. I can call her, I said calmly, but Sarah won't sign it now. Why not? Julian demanded. We'll just tell her it was a clerical error. We'll smooth it over. She won't sign it, I repeated, because she didn't just agree to the terms, Julian. She agreed to the team. I took a step back into the room. When we were negotiating, I said, my voice steady, Sarah asked me a question. She asked me what assurance she had that the quality would be maintained if management changed. She knew about the turnover. She knew about the firing of the warehouse staff. Julian narrowed his eyes. So, I continued. I told her the truth. I told her that as long as I was overseeing the procurement, the wood would be good. I told her my reputation was on the line. And? Arthur asked, leaning forward. And so she added a clause. I said, it was on page 22. The page you just ripped in half, Julian. I pointed to the debris on the table. It's called a key man clause, I explained. It states that the contract is valid only as long as Jonah Thorne is the lead on the project. If I am fired or removed from the project, the contract is void immediately, and there is a penalty. Julian's mouth opened, but no sound came out. What penalty? Asked Sterling, the board member. If the contract is voided due to the removal of the key man, I said, Sterling and Oates is liable for a cancellation fee to cover their time and the delay in their project. How much? Julian whispered, $200,000. I said, payable within 7 days. The silence now was heavy enough to crush bones. Julian looked at the torn paper. He looked at me. He looked at the board. "You're fired," he had said 2 minutes ago. "So," I said, checking my watch. A simple analog watch with a leather strap. "I believe I am no longer an employee here, which means you don't have a contract. You have a $200,000 debt, and you have a bank about to foreclose." "Rehire him," Sterling shouted, standing up. "Julian, rehire him right now. Apologize." Julian looked like he was going to vomit. He turned to me, his face a mask of panic and hatred. "Jonah, look, I was hasty. We can work this out. You're not fired, okay? You're not fired. We'll tape this up. We'll call Sarah together." I looked at him. I looked at the man who had mocked my work, who had fired my friends, who had treated the history of this company like garbage. "I'm afraid it's not that simple," I said. "Why not?" Julian pleaded. "I'm offering you your job back. I'll give you a raise." "Because," I said, reaching into my jacket pocket and pulling out a folded piece of paper. It wasn't a contract. It was a letter. "I accepted a new position this morning." "What?" Arthur whispered. "I knew this would happen," I said. "Maybe not today, maybe not like this, but I knew you would try to cut me out, Julian. So yesterday, when I finished the contract, I also finished this." I placed my resignation letter on the table, right next to the torn contract. "I didn't want to use it," I said. "I wanted to save this place, but you just made the choice for me." "You can't leave," Julian hissed. "You can't. If you leave, we lose everything." "You already lost it," I said. I turned and walked out of the boardroom. I walked down the plush hallway, back to the industrial carpet, back to my windowless office. I could hear shouting behind me. I could hear Julian's voice rising in panic, and Arthur's voice shouting him down. I went to my desk. I picked up my box of pens. I picked up my stone. I put them in my bag. I walked out to the parking lot. The rain felt good. It felt clean. But the story doesn't end there. You see, Julian thought he could fix this. He thought he could bully Sarah Holloway. He thought he could threaten me. He didn't realize that in the world of architectural salvage, you don't just tear things down. You have to know what's underneath. And what was underneath was about to rot the entire foundation of his life. I sat in my truck in the parking lot for 20 minutes. The rain was coming down harder now, drumming a frantic rhythm on the roof of my cab. It was an old Ford F-150, the kind with cloth seats that smell permanently of stale coffee and sawdust. It was a safe space, a quiet space. My phone was vibrating on the passenger seat. It buzzed against the fabric, stopped, and then buzzed again immediately. "Julian, Julian, Julian." I didn't pick up. I watched the water stream down the windshield, blurring the view of the Sterling and Oates building. It looked like a gray fortress from here. I saw the lights of the conference room on the third floor. I could imagine the chaos inside. Julian screaming at his assistant. Sterling, the board member, pacing. Arthur, the chairman, probably being wheeled out by his nurse, his heart breaking for the company he built. I reached for the phone, not to answer it, but to turn it off. As I did, a text message flashed on the screen. "You will pay for this. I'm calling legal." I powered the phone down. The screen went black. The silence inside the truck was heavy. My hands were shaking, just a little. It was the adrenaline crash. I put my hands on the steering wheel at 10 and 2. I took a breath, held it for 4 seconds, and exhaled. I looked at the dashboard. I had a small bobblehead dog there, a gift from my daughter. It was slightly crooked. I reached out and adjusted it until it was perfectly centered, facing straight forward. Then I put the truck in gear and drove away. I didn't go home. I couldn't go home yet. If I went home, I would sit on my couch and stare at the wall and let the fear creep in. And the fear was waiting, believe me. I had just walked away from a 6-figure salary, health insurance, and 15 years of tenure. I had a mortgage. I had tuition payments. The bravado of the boardroom was gone, replaced by the cold, hard math of survival. I drove to the Holloway construction site. It was on the east side of the city, a block of Victorian row houses that currently looked like a skeleton. Scaffolding wrapped around the brick facades like bandages. The site was active, even in the rain. I could hear the high-pitched whine of circular saws and the heavy thud of dumpsters being loaded. I parked and walked to the site trailer. My boots sank into the mud. The mud here was different than the salvage yard. It was full of clay and brick dust, red and sticky. I knocked on the metal door and pushed it open. Sarah Holloway was sitting at a folding table covered in blueprints. She was wearing a high-visibility vest over a wool sweater. She looked up, her glasses perched on the end of her nose. "You're early," she said. She didn't look surprised. "You knew?" I asked, shaking the rain off my jacket. "I got a call from a very frantic man named Julian about 10 minutes ago," she said. She took off her glasses and set them on the table. He sounded like he was hyperventilating. "He told me there had been a misunderstanding with the personnel, and that he would be personally overseeing our account moving forward." "What did you tell him?" "I told him I don't do business with strangers," Sarah said, and I hung up. She leaned back in her chair. "So, he actually did it? He fired you?" "He tried," I said. "I resigned first. But yes, the bridge is burned, and the contract is void. I'm sorry, Sarah. I know you needed those materials locked in by Friday." Sarah looked at me. She was a woman who measured people the way I measured timber, by their density, by how they handled pressure. "Jonah," she said, "do you remember why I hired Sterling and Oates? Because we have the best inventory in the state?" I said automatically. "No," she corrected. "Because you know where the inventory is. I've toured that warehouse. It's a labyrinth. Julian doesn't know a cornice from a corbel. If you aren't there, that inventory is just a pile of expensive junk." She opened a drawer in the filing cabinet next to her and pulled out a hard hat. She tossed it to me. "I wasn't joking about the job offer, Jonah, but we need to be clear about what it is. I'm not hiring you as a vendor. I'm hiring you as a consultant, director of material acquisition for the Holloway Trust. You work for me now, directly." I caught the hat. It felt light in my hands. "Julian is going to sue me," I said. "If I start working for you immediately, he'll claim I stole the client. He'll claim I violated a non-compete." "Let him sue," Sarah said, her eyes narrowing. "My lawyers eat guys like Julian for breakfast. But you're right, we need to be careful. You can't source from Sterling and Oates. We need to find a new supplier." "There isn't one," I said. "Not with that volume. Not with that quality. Sterling has the market cornered on local salvage. If we don't use them, we have to import from Europe, and that blows your budget and your timeline." Sarah tapped her pen on the table. "Tap, tap, tap. So we're stuck." "Not necessarily," I said. The idea was forming in the back of my mind, vague and dangerous. Julian has the inventory, but he doesn't want it. He wants cash. He's in trouble with the bank. He needs to liquidate. So, I said, he's going to panic. He's going to try to turn that wood into money as fast as possible. And when people panic, they make mistakes. I left the trailer an hour later, feeling steady. I had a direction. I wasn't just an unemployed man. I was a man with a mission. But I underestimated how quickly Julian would move. When I got home that evening, there was a black sedan parked in my driveway. A man in a cheap suit was leaning against the hood, smoking a cigarette. He dropped it and crushed it under his heel when I pulled in. "Jonah Thorne?" he asked. "Who are you?" I got out of my truck, keeping the door between us. "Courier," he grunted. He shoved a thick manila envelope at me. "You've been served." He got in his car and drove off before I could even look at the return address. But I didn't need to look. I knew where it came from. I went inside my house. It was a small craftsman bungalow I had restored myself. The floors were quarter-sawn oak, salvaged from a schoolhouse in 1920. I took off my boots and lined them up on the mat, left boot, right boot, perfectly parallel. I went to the kitchen table, moved the fruit bowl to the exact center, and opened the envelope. It wasn't just a lawsuit. It was a declaration of war. Plaintiff, Sterling and Oates Holdings, LLC. Defendant, Jonah Thorne. Counts, breach of fiduciary duty, tortious interference with business relations, theft of trade secrets, gross negligence. He was suing me for $5 million. I laughed. It was a dry, hollow sound. $5 million. I didn't have $5,000 in liquid cash. But reading further, I saw the real dagger. He had filed an emergency injunction. It froze my ability to contact any of Sterling and Oates' current or former clients. It specifically named the Holloway Trust. If I talked to Sarah, I was in contempt of court. If I worked for her, I was in contempt. Julian wasn't just firing me. He was blockading me. He knew he couldn't beat me on quality, so he was using the law to starve me out. He wanted me to come crawling back, or he wanted me destroyed. I poured myself a glass of water. I watched the bubbles rise to the surface. My phone rang. I had turned it back on. It was a number I didn't recognize. Hello? Jonah. The voice was a whisper. Rough, gravelly. Arthur? I asked. Don't say my name, the chairman whispered. He's listening. He monitors the company lines. I'm on a burner. Arthur, he sued me. I said. He served me papers tonight. I know, Arthur said. He was bragging about it. He's terrified, Jonah. He's terrified because the bank called. They gave him 10 days. 10 days to raise $2 million cash, or they take the keys. 10 days? I looked at the kitchen calendar. That's impossible. He can't generate that much revenue in 10 days. He's not trying to generate revenue, Arthur said. He's liquidating. He's announced a grand warehouse auction for next Saturday. He's hired an auctioneer. He's listing everything. The heart pine, the marble, the architectural antiques, everything we've saved for 20 years. My stomach turned. He can't auction that stuff. It needs to be brokered. It needs to be sold to the right buyers. If he auctions it, he'll get pennies on the dollar. He doesn't care, Arthur wheezed. He just needs the cash fast. He's going to sell 100 years of history for firewood prices just to cover his own mismanagement. I closed my eyes. I could see the warehouse in my mind, the smell of the cedar, the stacks of antique doors, each one unique. Julian was going to let people come in and pick it over like vultures. Jonah, Arthur said. You have to stop him. I can't, I said. I have an injunction. I can't step foot on the property. I can't talk to clients. If I show up, he'll have me arrested. You don't have to show up as an employee, Arthur said. It's a public auction, Jonah. Anyone can attend, even you. I don't have the money to buy anything, Arthur. I can't save the inventory. You don't need money, Arthur said. His voice dropped lower, becoming intense. You need the truth. Listen to me carefully. In my office, the old office, behind the portrait of the original foundry, there is a safe. I know the safe, I said. Julian had it drilled open the first week he arrived. It's empty. The main compartment is empty, Arthur said. But there is a false bottom. Julian never looks deeper than the surface. You know that. I gripped the phone tighter. What's in the false bottom? The blue ledger, Arthur said. I froze. The blue ledger was a myth. The guys in the warehouse used to joke about it. It was rumored to be Arthur's personal catalog of every single item that had ever entered the warehouse. Its true provenance, its appraisal value, and, most importantly, where it came from. It exists? I asked. It exists, Arthur said. And it proves that the inventory Julian is selling as generic salvage is actually protected heritage material. Some of those items, Jonah, some of those items have liens on them. We hold them in trust for historical societies. We don't own them outright. We just store them. If he sells items we don't own, it's fraud, Arthur said. Federal fraud. But no one knows those items are restricted except me, and I can't get there. The digital records were wiped when Julian switched systems. The blue ledger is the only proof. If I can get that ledger, I said, I can prove the auction is illegal. Yes, Arthur said, but you have to get it before the auction starts, or during it. Once those items are sold, the evidence is gone. He'll have security everywhere, I said. He'll be watching for me. Then don't be seen, Arthur said. You know that building better than the architect who designed it. You spent 12 years walking the catwalks. Arthur, I said. This is burglary. It's recovery, Arthur corrected. Save my company, Jonah. Please. The line went dead. I put the phone down on the table. I lined it up with the envelope, parallel. I stood there for a long time. The rain was still hammering against the roof. I thought about the injunction. I thought about the $5 million lawsuit. I thought about Julian's smile when he tore up my contract. He thought he had stripped me of everything. He thought that by taking away my title, my office, and my salary, he had made me powerless. But he had forgotten one thing. I wasn't a suit. I was a worker. I knew how things were built, and I knew how to take them apart. The next morning, I didn't call a lawyer. I called Ben. Ben was the forklift driver Julian hadn't fired yet, mostly because Ben was the only one who knew how to operate the antique diesel lift that could handle the heaviest beams. Ben was loyal. Ben had a mortgage too, so he kept his head down, but he hated Julian with a quiet, burning intensity. We met at a diner 3 towns over, away from prying eyes. Ben looked tired. He had sawdust in his eyebrows. It's a madhouse, Jonah, Ben said, dunking his toast in his coffee. He's got a crew of temps coming in tomorrow to tag everything. They're slapping stickers on 18th century mantles like they're selling used lawnmowers. He's pricing the heart pine at $2 a foot. $2. That wood is worth 12, I said quietly. I know, Ben said. It makes me sick. He's got the auction set for Saturday at noon. He's invited every liquidator and scavenger in the tri-state area. Security? I asked. Heavy, Ben said. He hired private security. 2 guys at the gate, 2 roaming the floor, and he told them specifically to look out for you. He put your picture up in the guard shack, Jonah. Do not admit. I need to get into Arthur's office, I said. Ben shook his head. Impossible. Arthur's office is locked. Julian has the only key, and the hallway has a camera now. There's no camera in the ventilation shaft above the molding room, I said. Ben paused. He looked at me, toast halfway to his mouth. You're crazy. That shaft hasn't been opened since the 90s. I cleaned it out myself in 2010, I said. It runs right over the executive wing. It vents out on the roof near the cooling tower. You want to crawl through the vents? Ben whispered. You're 6'2", Jonah. I fit, I said, but I need you to unlock the roof access hatch. It's rusted shut. You need to go up there and grease it. Can you do that? Ben looked down at his coffee. He swirled the dark liquid. He was risking his job. He was risking his livelihood. He called me unskilled labor yesterday, Ben said softly. He told the consultants that the warehouse staff were replaceable cogs. Ben looked up at me. I'll grease the hatch. When are you going in? Saturday, I said, during the auction. Why then? Why not at night? Because, I said, I don't just want to steal the book, Ben. I need to use it. I need an audience. If I take the book at night, he'll just claim I forged it. But if I produce it in front of the buyers, in front of the bank representatives, the chairman is going to be there? Arthur can't come, I said, but the bank will have observers there to ensure the proceeds go to them. If I can prove the sale is fraudulent in front of the bank, the auction stops. The inventory is frozen, and Julian is finished. And if you get caught, then I go to jail, I said, and Julian wins. The week passed in a blur of anxiety. I spent my days at the library, researching the legal codes for conversion of entrusted property. I spent my nights staring at the ceiling, playing the layout of the ventilation system in my mind. Turn left at the intake, straight for 20 feet, drop down into the mechanical closet next to Arthur's office. I practiced holding my breath. I practiced moving silently. I felt like a criminal. Maybe I was. But every time I felt a pang of doubt, I remembered the sound of that contract tearing. I remembered the disrespect. Not just to me, but to the work, to the history. Saturday morning arrived cold and bright. The rain had stopped, leaving the world scoured and clean. I dressed carefully. Dark jeans, black work shirt, steel-toed boots. I put my stone in my pocket. I checked my pens. I left them at home. I didn't need pens today. I needed a flashlight and a screwdriver. I parked my truck a mile away, in a strip mall lot. I walked the rest of the way, cutting through the woods that bordered the lumber yard. I could hear the auction before I saw it, the amplified voice of the auctioneer booming over the PA system. Do I hear 500? 500 for the lot of vintage brass? 500 going once. My heart hammered against my ribs. I reached the back fence. The chain link was cut in the corner, a hole we had never repaired because the deer used it. I slipped through. I skirted the edge of the lumber stacks, keeping to the shadows. The main yard was packed. There were hundreds of people, pickups, trailers, flatbeds, men in flannel shirts examining the wood, city developers in sleek coats looking for bargains, and Julian. I saw him standing on a raised platform near the loading dock. He was wearing a new suit, a light gray one. He was holding a microphone, beaming. He looked like a king, surveying his kingdom. He was crunching ice from a cup. I could see the motion of his jaw from 50 yards away. He had no idea that the ground beneath him was about to open up. I circled around to the back of the main building, the fire escape. It was rusted, but solid. I climbed up, rung by rung, the cold metal biting into my palms. I reached the roof. It was flat, covered in gravel. I crouched low, moving toward the cooling tower. There was the hatch. I reached for the handle. If Ben had chickened out, if it was still rusted shut, this was over. I gripped the iron wheel. I turned. It moved, smooth as silk. It had been greased with heavy industrial lubricant. Thank you, Ben. I opened the hatch and stared down into the darkness. The smell of dust and old air hit me. It was the smell of the building's lungs. I lowered myself in. I crawled. It was tight. The metal screws of the ductwork snagged my clothes. It was hot. I could hear the auctioneer's voice vibrating through the metal walls. A muffled drone. Sold. To the gentleman in the red hat. Next item. I counted the turns. Left, straight, right. I reached the grate that looked down into Arthur's office. I peered through the slats. The office was dark, empty. The heavy velvet curtains were drawn. I used my screwdriver to undo the corners of the grate. 1, 2, 3, 4. I lowered the grate down onto the carpet. Then I dropped. I landed silently. I was in. I stood up and scanned the room. It was exactly as Arthur had left it, except for the dust, the massive desk, the oil paintings. And there, behind the portrait of the original foundry, the wall, safe. I walked over. I moved the painting. The safe door was ajar, the lock drilled out, just as Arthur said. I opened it. The main compartment was empty. I ran my hand along the bottom metal plate. It felt solid. I pressed in the corners. Nothing. Panic. Had Arthur imagined it? Was his memory failing? Julian never looks deeper than the surface, he had said. I looked closer. There was a tiny lip of metal near the hinge. Not a button, a slide. I pushed the slide to the left. Click. The bottom plate popped up. My heart stopped. Lying in the recess, wrapped in oilcloth, was a book. It was thick, bound in blue leather, the spine cracked with age. The blue ledger. I pulled it out. It was heavy. I opened it. Page 1. 1,890. White oak beams. Sourced from St. Jude's Cathedral. Provenance. Verified. Restriction. Historical Trust Lien. Page 2. 1,910. Marble facade. Sourced from First National Bank. Restriction. City Heritage Loan. It was all there. Every item. Every restriction. And Julian was selling it all right now. I closed the book. I had the weapon. Now I just had to walk into the lion's den and fire it. I went to the office door. I cracked it open. The hallway was empty. The auction was happening in the main warehouse floor, down the hall and through the double doors. I took a deep breath. I smoothed my shirt. I gripped the ledger in my right hand. I walked down the hall. I could hear Julian's voice now. He had taken the microphone from the auctioneer. Ladies and gentlemen, Julian was booming. We have a special treat coming up next. Lot 400, the collection of stained glass from the old library. We're starting the bidding at a very aggressive price. I pushed open the double doors to the warehouse floor. The light was blinding for a second. The noise was deafening. I walked out onto the mezzanine, the metal walkway that overlooked the entire warehouse floor. I was 20 feet above them. "Excuse me," I shouted. My voice wasn't amplified, but it was loud. I had spent 12 years shouting over saw blades. It carried. Heads turned. 500 people looked up. Julian looked up. He squinted against the lights. When he saw me, his smile vanished. He dropped his cup of ice. "Security!" Julian screamed into the microphone. "Security! Get him! That man is trespassing!" 2 large men in uniforms started running toward the stairs. I held the blue ledger high in the air. "This auction is fraud," I yelled. The crowd murmured. The auctioneer froze. "Don't listen to him," Julian yelled, his voice cracking. "He's a disgruntled ex-employee. Arrest him. This is the master inventory ledger," I shouted, my voice echoing off the steel beams. "The items in Lot 400 do not belong to Sterling and Oates. They are property of the City Heritage Trust. If you buy them, you are buying stolen goods." The room went silent. The buyers looked at each other. The bank representatives, 3 men in dark suits standing near the front, stiffened. "He's lying!" Julian shrieked. "Get him off the walkway!" The security guards were pounding up the metal stairs. I could feel the vibration of their boots. I had maybe 10 seconds before they reached me. I looked down at the bank representatives. I made eye contact with the lead banker. "Check the provenance," I yelled. "Ask him for the provenance papers. He doesn't have them." I threw the book. It wasn't a reckless throw. It was calculated. I tossed the heavy blue leather book over the railing. It spun through the air, heavy with truth. It landed with a massive thud right at the feet of the lead banker. The banker looked at the book. He looked at Julian. He looked at me. Then, he bent down and picked it up. The security guards reached me. They grabbed my arms, pinning them behind my back. They slammed me against the railing. "You're done, Jonah," Julian shouted from the stage, his face purple. "Take him out. Call the police." But the banker wasn't looking at me. He was opening the book. He flipped a page. He looked at the stained glass stacked on the pallets. He looked at the book again. He closed the book. He looked up at the auctioneer. "Stop the sale," the banker said. His voice was calm, but he had a microphone on his lapel. It boomed through the speakers. "What?" Julian stammered. "I said stop the sale," the banker repeated. He walked toward the stage, clutching the blue ledger. "We need to have a conversation, Mr. Sterling. Right now." Julian looked at the banker. He looked at the crowd, who were now pulling out their phones, recording. He looked at me, pinned against the railing high above him. For the first time ever, I saw Julian forget to chew his ice. He looked small. The security guard twisted my arm. "Let's go, buddy. You're going for a ride." "That's fine," I said, watching Julian's world crumble. I love a good ride. The handcuffs were tight. That was the first thing I noticed. Not the pain, but the cold, specific pressure of steel against the radius bone of my wrist. The security guards didn't treat me gently. They hauled me down the metal stairs, my boots skidding on the diamond plate steps. They marched me past the stunned crowd, past the pallets of stained glass, past the rows of heart pine I had spent a decade curing. I didn't look at the crowd. I looked at the floor. I saw the sawdust. I saw the scuff marks of 1,000 boots. Julian was still screaming from the stage. His voice was shrill, cracking with a panic that the microphone only amplified. "He stole that book. It's a forgery. Officer, I want him charged with corporate espionage. I want him charged with assault." The police had arrived. 2 officers in rain-slicked uniforms were waiting at the bottom of the stairs. They took custody of me from the private security. One of them, a younger cop with a tired face, pushed my head down as he guided me into the back of the patrol car parked right near the loading dock. The door slammed. The sound was final. Thunk. I was alone in the back seat. The divider was hard plastic, scratched and cloudy. Through the window, I watched the scene unfold like a silent movie. I saw the banker, the man in the dark suit, standing in the center of the warehouse floor. He wasn't looking at me. He was reading the blue ledger. He was turning pages slowly, methodically. 2 other suits were looking over his shoulder. I saw Julian running toward them. He was waving his hands. He grabbed the banker's arm. That was a mistake. The banker didn't flinch. He just looked at Julian's hand on his sleeve, then looked at Julian. He said something short. Julian recoiled as if he'd been slapped. The banker pulled a phone from his pocket and made a call. He didn't walk away to do it. He stood right there, staring at the inventory, making the call that would end everything. Then the patrol car engine started. The vibration came up through the seat. We drove away. I spent the next 6 hours in a holding cell at the county precinct. It was a small room, painted a color that was supposed to be calming, but looked like old mustard. There was a metal bench bolted to the floor. I sat on it. I didn't panic. Strange as it sounds, I felt a deep, resonant peace. I had done the thing. I had thrown the truth into the machinery. Whatever happened to me now, jail, fines, a criminal record, it was worth it to stop the erasure of that history. I focused on the wall opposite me. The cinder blocks were painted over, but I could see the lines of mortar underneath. I counted them. 12 rows, 8 blocks per row, 96 blocks. Order, structure. At 7 p.m., the heavy door buzzed and clicked open. "Thorne," the desk sergeant called out. "You're free to go." I stood up, my knees stiff. "Free?" "Charges were dropped," he said, not looking up from his paperwork. "The complainant withdrew his standing, and your bail was posted." "By who?" "By me." I looked past the sergeant. Standing in the fluorescent glare of the hallway was Sarah Holloway. She was still wearing her high-visibility vest, but she looked immaculate, like she owned the police station. We walked out into the night. The rain had started again, a soft, cleansing drizzle. "You're an idiot, Jonah," Sarah said as we walked to her car, a sturdy Land Rover parked at the curb. "I know," I said. "Don't thank me yet," she said. "My lawyer is currently in a shouting match with the district attorney to make sure the trespassing charge stays buried. But we have leverage." "What leverage?" We got into the car. Sarah turned on the heater. It blasted warm air against my cold hands. "The bank," she said. "The man you threw the book at? That was David Vance. He's the vice president of commercial risk for First City Bank. He called me an hour ago." "Why did he call you?" "Because your name is all over the blue ledger," she said. Arthur kept meticulous notes. Inspected by Jonah Thorne. Verified by Jonah Thorne. Vance realized that you were the only person who actually knew what the hell any of that stuff was. He realized that if he prosecuted you, he'd be throwing away the only asset guide he has. She put the car in gear. "Sterling and Oates is in receivership, Jonah. As of 4 p.m. today, the bank seized the building. They seized the inventory. They seized the accounts." "And Julian?" I asked. Sarah didn't answer immediately. She merged onto the highway, the wipers rhythmic and steady. "Julian is having a very bad day," she said finally. When Vance cross-referenced the ledger with the auction list, he found 42 counts of wire fraud. Selling restricted assets across state lines is a federal offense. "The FBI arrived at the warehouse while you were being booked." I looked out the window at the passing streetlights. I felt a weight lift off my chest, a weight I hadn't realized I'd been carrying for years. "What about Arthur?" I asked. "Arthur is fine," she said. "He's at home. He's the one who told the bank where to look for the digital backups Julian thought he deleted. Arthur's mind is sharper than anyone gave him credit for." She glanced at me. "So, you're unemployed. You have a pending lawsuit that is likely moot, but still annoying. And you have a reputation as a whistleblower who throws heavy objects at bankers." "That sounds about right," I said. "Good," Sarah said. "Then you can start Monday." "Start what?" "The Holloway project," she said. "I still need floors, Jonah. And now, the bank has a warehouse full of them that they have no idea how to sell. They're going to need a broker to liquidate the assets legally and ethically to pay off the debt. I suggested you." I looked at her. "You want me to buy the inventory from the company that fired me?" "No," she smiled. "I want you to manage the sale. You'll be working for the bank, technically. You'll ensure the restricted items go back to the trusts, and the sellable items go to the buyers who respect them. Like me." I sat back in the seat. I watched the rain streak the glass. It took 3 months to untangle the mess. The lawsuit against me was dismissed with prejudice 3 days later. It's hard for a plaintiff to sue for interference when the plaintiff is currently under indictment for grand larceny and fraud. I returned to the Sterling and Oates building on a Tuesday morning. The sign out front was gone, removed by the bank. The windows were papered over. I wasn't an employee anymore. I was an independent asset manager, hired by First City Bank. I had the keys. I unlocked the front door. The air inside was stale. It smelled of neglect, but underneath that, faintly, I could still smell the cedar and the pine, the smell of the work. I walked through the empty offices. Julian's office had been cleared out by the authorities. His desk was bare, except for a coffee stain on the leather blotter. The expensive ergonomic chair was overturned. I set it upright. I didn't sit in it. I didn't want to. I went to the warehouse. Ben was there. The bank had agreed to keep the warehouse staff on, to help with the cataloging. When I walked onto the floor, the sound of boots on concrete stopped. Ben looked up from a clipboard. He grinned. He didn't say anything. He just nodded, then went back to checking a crate of hinges. The other guys nodded too. A quiet acknowledgement. The hierarchy of respect had been restored. I spent the next 6 weeks organizing the liquidation. It wasn't an auction. It was a curation. I called the architects and the restorers I had known for 15 years. I told them the truth. The company was gone, but the wood was safe. We returned the stained glass to the Historical Society. We returned the marble to the City Trust. And the rest, the white oak, the heart pine, the brass fixtures, we sold at fair market value. The Holloway Trust bought the flooring. Sarah got her materials. The bank got their money. And Julian got his consequences. I didn't go to the trial. I didn't need to see him in handcuffs. I didn't need to see him weep or make excuses. I read about it in the paper, like everyone else. He took a plea deal, 5 years in federal prison for fraud and embezzlement. It turns out the key man clause I had written into the Holloway contract, the one he tore up, became a central piece of evidence. The prosecution used my draft to prove that Julian knew the value of the relationships he was destroying, and that his actions were calculated negligence. The document he tried to destroy ended up being the paper trail that convicted him. But the real ending of this story isn't about courtrooms or prison sentences. It's about a specific Tuesday afternoon, the day we closed the warehouse for the last time. The building had been sold to a logistics company. They were going to gut it, turn it into a distribution center for online retail. The history was leaving the building. I was the last one there. I did a final sweep. I walked the catwalks. I checked the ventilation shaft one last time, just to be sure. I ended up in the small, windowless office near the break room. My old office. It was empty. My desk was still there, scratched and worn. I reached into my pocket. I pulled out my stone, the smooth river rock. I placed it on the desk. Then I reached into my bag. I took out 3 pens. I laid them on the desk. I nudged them with my finger. Tap, tap, tap. They were perfectly parallel, 1 inch apart. I stood there for a minute, looking at them. I thought about the fear I had felt when Julian tore that paper. I thought about the anger, and I realized that the anger was gone. It had been replaced by something sturdier. I had lost my job, yes. I had lost the company I loved, but I had saved the things that mattered. The wood would go into new homes. The brass would shine on new doors. The history would survive. I wasn't a head of procurement anymore. I was just Jonah. And for the first time in a long time, that felt like enough. I picked up the pens. I picked up the stone. I walked out of the office and turned off the lights. Outside, a car was waiting. It wasn't a police car. It wasn't a lawyer's sedan. It was a vintage 1965 Mercedes convertible, cherry red. The top was down, despite the chill in the air. Arthur was in the passenger seat. He looked frail, wrapped in a thick wool coat and a scarf, but he was smiling. He wasn't driving. His tremors were too bad for that. "Get in," Arthur rasped. I climbed into the driver's seat. The leather was soft and cracked with age. It smelled of real leather, not the synthetic stuff in Julian's office. "Where to, Chairman?" I asked. Arthur looked back at the empty warehouse. He raised a shaking hand and gave it a small, dismissive wave. "Forward, Jonah," he said. "Just forward." I put the car in gear. We drove out of the parking lot, leaving the empty shell of Sterling and Oates behind us. We drove toward the city, where the scaffolding was coming down on the Holloway project, revealing the beautiful, restored brickwork underneath. We didn't talk. We didn't need to. We just drove, 2 men who knew the value of things that last, listening to the hum of a well-maintained engine and the sound of the wind rushing past us. Thank you for listening to my story. If you've ever had to stand up for your work against someone who didn't understand its value, hit that like button and subscribe. It helps us share more stories like this one.